India had a significant success with a historic consensus at the G20. And one of the issues that was discussed was also women empowerment. It was a grouping that was decided that will take care of the underrepresentation that happens, particularly for women, in the political spaces as well. But soon after the G20 success, India had a historic Women's Reservation Bill passed on a special session of the Parliament, something that was being discussed for decades together. To discuss that and a lot more, we have with us Ambassador Lakshmi Puri, who is the former Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and has also been former Deputy Executive Director of UN Women. Thank you very much, ma'am, for joining us.
My pleasure.
At the very outset, in your entire life as a diplomat, you have worked for gender equality. You have touched upon these subjects at different forums, at different multilaterals as well. How significant is India's move at this special session on the Women's Reservation Bill? What does this mean for India and the world?
Well, first of all, I would like to really express my true gratitude and happiness at the passing of this bill to Prime Minister Modi, who showed the courage to take this forward as was promised by the Bharatiya Janata Party as far back as in 2014, and he has gathered the essential to put this finally through. And it is a real breakthrough in so many ways, and it means so much for India, the women and girls of India, but also for the world. You began by talking about the G20 and how it was one of the thematic priorities of the women-led development was one of the thematic priorities of the G20. And Prime Minister Modi has conceptualized this, pioneered this concept, and it was consecrated in the New Delhi Summit Leaders' Declaration. And the key thing there was that women should have full, equal, effective, and meaningful participation in decision-making in all spheres. This is now part of the G20 mantra and credo, thanks to India. And then soon thereafter, as you rightly pointed out, you have the passage of this bill, which has been hanging fire for 27 years. So all women and girls of India, and I deign to speak for them, and I think women of the world and women activists, civil society, women's organizations, I think we are all delighted that this has finally come through. So, what is the significance? It is because for the first time you have what is called in the gender equality parlance and in the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, of the United Nations, of which India has ratified it, is a member, so is a signatory. So under that, this is characterized as what is called a temporary special measure to accelerate the achievement of de facto equality. We have de jure equality in the Constitution of India, but in order to reach de facto and accelerate the process to that, we need temporary special measures. So this is this reservation bill. So that's the first thing. The second aspect, which is very important to note here, is that this is part of a metamorphosis that you need to bring about true gender equality and women's empowerment. Political participation, voice, participation and leadership is a means to also empowering the gender bias, empowering women and girls more broadly, economically, socially, and in terms of the ending the gender bias, the boy preference, girl aversion mentality, which Prime Minister Modi attacked right from the beginning with his Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao campaign, and which resulted in, thankfully, for the first time, are having corrected the sex ratio that was skewed. So that is a very important aspect, that political empowerment will also drive other empowerment processes. Now, the question is, how do we also see it in the global context? The women of India constitute 1/6 of the women in the world, 18%. And if they show the way, they blaze the trail, and India blazes the trail in terms of women's political participation and leadership in decision making, in law making, in policy making, and governance at the highest levels, then we are really also triggering and inspiring a global movement as the world's largest and oldest democracy. You cannot be a true democracy unless half of its population, which is women, also participate equally in democratic processes and leadership. So that's the big message we give to the world, and that's the mission that we have in this. The other aspect that we need to bear in mind in terms of anything that we do, in terms of the great socio-economic transformations that are being driven right now through Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas projects, that we are showing the world that we can do things to scale. India has both the advantage and a disadvantage of scale and scope. So if we can show that this will work, then the world will also gain confidence that yes, this works. And we join some 40 other countries who have adopted similar measures, temporary special measures. So our success in this is crucial. And India is a microcosm of the world. If we succeed, the world will succeed in achieving gender equality and women's empowerment and gender parity. And one thing that I think we need to really do is to make sure that the political resistance, the patriarchy in the political system, as well as in the population in general, which has held back this measure for so long, has to be also deconstructed from now on. And if I may add, this is something that we will need to work on. And that's the way forward, is also has to be as determined, as well prepared as what we have done before.
Well, Prime Minister Modi, since the very beginning, has had top of his agenda women empowerment. He showed the way on several controversial issues, including triple talaq, and now the Womens Reservation Bill, and in the meanwhile, several central schemes that were not reaching particularly the rural women are now, in fact, in their favor. We've also seen, India's might at the G20. We've seen India as a leader of the Global South, with African Union as a permanent member at the G20. And of course, now domestically, we are looking towards elections. How significant is Prime Minister Modi's approach of bringing these historical changes in benefit of the women of the country, and what does this mean overall about women empowerment in India?
Well, it is indeed a critical element, gender parity in political processes and political decision making and governance is central to gender equality and women's empowerment. So that is a big step. other steps that you have mentioned, also the fact that in every scheme and every mission of his, he really mainstreams gender, targets gender equality and women's empowerment, is a very eloquent indication of something he is passionate about, he's committed about, and it goes beyond political expediency. I think this is what has been demonstrated very well. Now, going forward, I think what is important is that we address, as government, both at the central and state levels, we address some key issues that will enable this historic, as you said, historic, but I would say it has made her story as much as history, this Women's Reservation, Act. So now, going forward, what we need to do is to address the supply side and the demand side, the push and the pull factors, and prepare the ecosystem for that. So what do I mean by that? Firstly, when we talk about the women being themselves prepared for leadership. So on that side, what we will call the push factors. The push factor is this. Firstly, that women at home, we have to create this new narrative. And I think the passage of this bill now puts the idea into the minds of parents everywhere that my girl, my daughter can be a leader. That's very important. So that change of mindset has to be handled both at the demand side and the supply side. The other aspect is education. As women and girls, study, go to school and college, again, some kind of, I would say, even indoctrination that they can be leaders. The third aspect is, to create constituencies, because who are going to vote for them? Will men vote for them? If so, for what reason? Because men have been so accustomed mostly to vote for men. And our belief is that 500 men cannot represent one woman as well as one woman can represent all women. So that principle, if you follow, you have to build constituencies. So how can that be done? That has to be addressed by women themselves. They need networks. So how do you reach and how do you use existing networks like the self-help groups, the enormous networks that now exist on the economic side, Seva, all these other networks. So use that to create leaders, women leaders, and build women leaders. And women have to do it themselves as well. So there has to be this movement building around creating candidates who can fight and win elections. The other aspect of the demand side is, of course, how to, but that comes also on the supply side, how to fit into political parties or launch political parties, women only political parties. I mean, there have been cases, I've seen it in other countries where we have worked when I was with UN Women. So you need to have your own mobilization instruments, political parties, either you join one or you form your own. So this is something that women have. And then we have the grassroots. We have the grassroots leaders already, 1.4 million of them, women who are the panchayat and Jila Parishad members and sarpanches and so on. So we have to also build them up and use their experience. Both, some of the weaknesses of that system, and we have to correct that, but also the strengths, build on that strength. And that provides a kind of catchment area for you to take the assembly, MLAs and MPs, women who can then form this, who can really be eligible for and then win elections and join the parliaments and state assemblies. So that is that part. Then the other part is on the supply side. I think all these institutions, whether it is the parliament or the state assemblies, we need to make them gender sensitive. They have to be gender mainstream, because again, the Pitru Satta mentality is very much there. So we have to change that. The other aspect is, of course, training, and institutions of training exist, but we have to make them more gender focused, because we have to train women leaders, even more with greater force than we have been doing before. And then finance. Finance is going to be a major problem, as we have seen. And training is this whole issue of capability poverty, this whole concept of poverty capability. So that aspect we need to address on the supply side, and also finance we have to provide, because women are not always equipped with the kind of financial heft these days to fight elections. And political parties have to then provide, they have to have their own quotas. They have to help women build constituencies up, because that's the time that now you have.
Ma'am, you yourself mentioned that it took 27 long years. Why do you think that it took 27 long years? Of course, you mentioned patriarchy and a lot of other aspects, but how difficult was it to fight this for 27 long years? And do you think, compared to then, are we ready now to see this very much due strength and power of women in Indian politics? And secondly, why did we see over the last many decades not many women at the helm of affairs in governance in India? We've perhaps seen only 2 women presidents and 1 prime minister. Do you think with this recognition, with this step, it's likely to change?
It is a very important step, as I said. The reason that we were not probably able to do this earlier is twofold. One is that we don't have a proportional representation system. It's first past the post electoral system. So the electoral system is not as amenable to the application of the quota, women's quota, as the proportional representation system. So it always means the men will feel that I have nurtured a particular constituency and I will be asked to vacate it next time. What's the point? And it doesn't really serve the purpose of representation and governance. So, all these arguments were used in the past. The second argument was, of course, which has been even again used, but disabused by, I think, the government when they presented the bill. That is that how do you provide for what we in gender equality terms call intersectionality. So this means that within the group of women who are discriminated against, there are some that face multiple and compounded discrimination on account of caste, or remoteness, or poverty, or rural, urban divide, and all of that. So that intersectionality, this bill for the first time addresses, and that's why it got through, because it is very inclusive in terms of addressing the reservation 33, within the 33 of 33% reservation for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. So that was a very important part which was missing in the past. So it is now included, and that's why it's a more complete bill and adhiniyam. So now it's for the all concerned to take this forward, as I said, addressing both the demand and supply aspects, create the right ecosystem on both sides so that this bill truly becomes transformational for gender equality and women's empowerment, that we truly become a lesson and a model, role model for the world. And women's democracy as much as a democracy for, by, and of women as much as of men and by men and for men. So that's a very important objective we have, and I think we have a clear path ahead.
Ma'am, you saw the recent G20 success. You saw this historical consensus that was achieved. Time and again it was told that, nothing significant will happen in New Delhi. As a keen foreign policy watcher, as someone who's been in diplomacy and now writing about it as a key participant and advisor, how significant do you think this G20 success was for New Delhi? And do you think Prime Minister Modi's charisma and his approach, and of course the Indian diplomats, made it happen?
Indeed, I would say that I've watched all the G20s since their inception, all these summits since their inception. And also I've watched, I have been part of the North-South dialogue and cooperation initiatives and processes for many decades. And I would say that this summit, G20 summit, and India's presidency has been extraordinary in terms of the kind of commitment, the kind of investment that was made, political, financial, diplomatic, and human. In every way, this was unprecedented. It is unmatched, I would say, I will be so bold as to say it is unmatched in the significance of its outcomes. 112 outcomes, not only in numbers, but that these outcomes addressed most urgent, important, and also most difficult issues in North-South cooperation, economic and financial cooperation and governance, but also global public goods in a number of areas like health, nutrition, and disaster response. So it has been also exceptional and unprecedented in terms of the scale and scope of the undertaking, and the fact that it has been a veritable Jan Andolan, both within India, but also in terms of the projection outside. As many as 67 million people are said to have participated and engaged and contributed to this G20 presidency of India, which is completely unheard of and truly historic, a people's G20, as Prime Minister Modi had promised right at the beginning. It is also historic in another way. The first ever Voice of the Global South Summit was held by India before the G20 summit, or rather at the beginning of the G20 summit, and Prime Minister said to the 125 leaders who had come together that your voice is going to be my voice, our voice, and your priorities are going to be India's priorities. And he acted upon that, both in terms of inviting There were some 40, it was one of the most inclusive G20 summits ever, both in terms of inviting countries from the South and their participation in different events, and also the largest ever participation from Africa, and then the master stroke of getting African Union to be a permanent member of G20. That really has changed the whole discourse, so to say. And this is important because African Union is a regional grouping of 54 countries of representing 1.4 billion people, almost the same as India. And it is also a continent of great promise, as much as it's struggling on so many different fronts, and which needs the global system to work for its development. So for India to have brought that in, to make the G20 more representative and more sensitive to African interests, I think is a really major salute to the global South and its needs. It's for Africa itself to be at the high table and be part of a veritable economic security council is a very big leap. And I think this is going to really transform our relationship with Africa going forward, economic, strategic, bilaterally, but also multilaterally. And of course, for G20, what we managed to do by having African Union join is to make it more credible and representative without making it unwieldy. So that was the very important aspect of our working for the Global South, and the achievement of this G20 summit and India's presidency. The other aspect which is very important in terms of what was done for the Global South is our choice of the the priority themes, where we insisted that we should have meaningful, what he called action-oriented, what Prime Minister called meaningful, action-oriented, decisive outcomes on a range of issues which are of concern to the developing countries, from the regression in SDG achievement. We are 88% of the targets we are off track as developing countries. So, and the issue of SDG finance, climate finance, and technology, all of those issues, reform of multilateral institutions to serve, to be fit for purpose, to be fit for sustainable development purpose and needs of developing countries. Then you also have the women-led development was one of the key priorities that were highlighted. And also, very importantly, despite the disunity and as what Prime Minister referred to as the lack of trust, the mistrust that was there, what India managed to do was to unify the East and the West and the North and the South in so many ways around meeting the multiple crises, what we call the poly-crisis, simultaneous, overlapping. So these crises, food, fuel, fertilizer, financial, and the huge crushing debt crisis that some 70 developing countries face. So on all of that, we got very specific and very progressive, sometimes groundbreaking, but at other times it was about starting something and then it will have to be taken forward. So it was really very productive from that perspective as well. For example, on SDG financing, there was an agreement that you need at least 1.2 trillion on SDG financing for developing countries, and that 260 billion per year has to be provided by the multilateral development banks till 2030 per year. So, these kind of affirmations, commitments, and then of course the reform of the strengthening of the capacity of the multilateral development banks to do all of this. Also reforming their operational methods, all of that, democratizing these multilateral institutions. So that was one very important thing. And also, of course, adopting SDG related principles, which are going to guide the next 7 years. Also the data related agreement. So the data for development project is very important, because unless we have data, how will we monitor whether we are making progress on the sustainable development goals? So a very rich portfolio. On climate, for the first time, a recognition, an admission, and in a way commitment that developing countries have, minus China, have to be, will need 5.9 trillion of in resources, in finance, for funding their nationally determined contributions, and whatever targets and more ambitious targets that they set and which they are being asked to take. Similarly, for technology alone, you will need climate-friendly technology alone, you will need 4 trillion. So this whole shift, both in terms of SDG financing and climate financing, from billions to trillions that are needed, and that the northern countries, that is the developed countries, and the multilateral institutions have to raise their game, is really a very big plus and a major win, as is the recognition that wherever there are commitments to be made, the countries, developing countries, are given the benefit of more policy space, because according to their needs and capacities. Because whether if you're looking at climate, climate action, the developing countries, then the principle of common but differentiated responsibility applies.
One final question, if you could answer briefly, is about the changing foreign policy of India, the paradigm shift that has been brought in over the last few years. You've been there for years together. You've seen from inside and from outside. What kind of a change do you witness now? And how significant is it for India's standing globally?
Let me also relate it back to G20. What it has done. In a way, it has center staged India into the evolution that it has earned. It has become the 5th largest economy. So it could use the argument of power when it interacted with the other participants in the G20. Because it is the 5th largest economy and it's going on to become the 3rd largest very soon. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, G20 also showed the world how far we have come in terms of our economic progress, but also our technological prowess. Chandrayaan 3 just happened before the G20 summit, very happily and felicitously. But also the fact that we were able to show them how we are deploying technology for sustainable development. The JAM, Trinity, and that marvel of socio-economic engineering using technological transformation and digital public infrastructure. This is something, again, we are setting role models for the world. So that is also something that puts us in a different, at a different high level. The other aspect is, I think the world very much recognized how, the prodigious efforts that India made to deal with the calamitous COVID-19, socio-economic meltdown that it caused, but also the response, India's really Bhagirath-like response to that calamity, and how overcoming that, launching the world's largest vaccine program, overcoming that, and then being able to also send out 300 million vaccines to over 100 countries through the Vaccine Maitri program. I think that, there were some participants who were saying that, Indian vaccine now runs in my blood. I was saved by it. So there is that. It's a really amazing, recognition of what India has done and achieved. It's an achievement. Also, the fact, you were talking about the foreign policy and perception and soft power and hard power. So here, in terms of soft power, I think we really came through as a civilizational state. The depth, the diversity, the magnificence, and the grandeur of our culture, spirituality, all of that came through so beautifully at this G20 summit, and the presidency throughout. And something like 300,000 participants from outside India who got to see this, but also in terms of I don't know how many millions saw it on television over the whole presidency of India. So that's the other aspect, the civilizational state that is India. And then we found ourselves, you began by asking about how everybody was predicting that maybe this is an economic, financial forum. It's a forum for economic and social and financial and global governance and economic cooperation between North and South, meaning developed and developing countries, and for the world, because it also sets templates for the governance of the world, like on international taxation or on cyber assets and all of that. But then political issues were going to break the deal, were going to be the deal breaker. So that was what prophesied. But the very fact that India was able to be the bridge builder and unifier, as I mentioned, shows also that we made full capital out of the fact that we are in, as many have said, in a geopolitical sweet spot to be a kind of a leading force that bridges, a bridging force, a balancing force. So we use that bridging power. And I think that also established us further in that space. And that's another transformation that you see now.
Well, Ambassador Lakshmi Puri, it's always a pleasure interacting with you. Thank you very much for joining us.